Okay, 1, 2, here we go. Good evening. Thank you for coming out. Nice to have everybody here. Let's get warm. Come on in, get warm. This is VBS College of Jewish Studies. I'm Ed Feinstein, one of the rabbis here, and I'm delighted to welcome you on this chilly, horrible night. Glad you're here. Come on in and get warm. Leave your coat on if you'd like. It'll warm up slowly. We'll welcome each other. I want to welcome Dr. Galef, who just had a new great-grandchild, right? Just this week on Saturday. Mazel tov. Many, many blessings. Many blessings, many blessings. Any other simchas I need to know about? Anyone hit the jackpot, get married? All right, well, in that case, welcome. We're glad you're here. This is VBS College of Jewish Studies, where we offer university-level learning without the quizzes, football games, or sororities. And we're glad you're here. If everyone will stand up for a moment, turn around and say hi to the folks behind you. Say hello and welcome. Hi, good evening. Now, don't sit down yet. You're going to be sitting a long time. Put your arms around each other. Get close. We're all one family, so get close, get close, get close. Shh. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu mitzvotav etzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shechianu v'kiyamanu v'gianu lasman hazeh. In just a few hours, 3 more hostages are getting out, and 5 Thai workers. Why they held Thai workers, I have no idea, are getting out, and we'll pray that on Shabbos a few more will get out. So let's pray for peace. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Please be seated. I want to begin tonight with 3 stories. The first story takes place in approximately the year 120 CE, AD, after 0. And it's recorded in the Talmud. A father sends his son up to the rafters of the barn to collect some eggs from a nest that is there. The boy climbs up, and when he reaches the nest, he shoos away the mother bird and takes the eggs. Now, the Talmud remembers that the boy has now fulfilled 2 great mitzvot, 2 great commandments. He has obeyed his father, he has honored his father's wishes, and he has shooed away the mother bird. And what's extraordinary about these 2 mitzvot in the Torah is that they're the only 2 mitzvot in the entirety of the Torah where the reward for the mitzvah is listed right after the mitzvah. And the reward for these 2 commandments is a long life. And on the way down the ladder, the boy falls and he dies. One of the great young rabbinic masters watched this scene. His name was Elisha ben Abuya. He was the most brilliant of the young rabbis. And he sees this happen, and his heart is broken, and he screams out, "Late din v'late dayan." There is no justice, and there is no judge. And Elisha ben Abuya tears his clothes and declares himself a heretic, and he becomes the most famous heretic in all of Jewish history. Anyone who ever read that wonderful book by Milton Steinberg, As a Driven Leaf, that's the guy. He becomes a heretic because this isn't the way the world is supposed to be. because the world is not supposed to tolerate such events like this. God isn't supposed to tolerate events like this, and therefore, late din v'late dayan, there must not be a God who watches over us. Story number one. Story number two takes place in 1922. A young Orthodox rabbi, newly ordained and returned from his trip to Europe where he begot an ordination, is the newly appointed rabbi of the West Side Jewish Center in Manhattan. His name is Mordechai M. Kaplan. And he's giving a Pesach sermon on the first day of Passover to a crowded Orthodox synagogue. And in the middle of the sermon, brilliant, fiery sermon, Kaplan stops. And later in his autobiography, he says, he did something which I can attest to. Rabbis should never do in the middle of their own sermons. He asked himself, do you believe this stuff? Do you really believe what you're saying? Kaplan had been educated, in addition to his Orthodox yeshiva training, he had been educated at City College and at Columbia University, where he was completing a PhD with John Dewey, the great philosopher. Kaplan was deeply entrenched in science, which was the philosophy of the world in the 1920s. And suddenly, he hears himself talking about splitting seas and burning bushes and frogs coming from the sea and hail with fire. And he's listening to himself, and he stops, and he just stopped, and he's just stood there for a long time. And the congregation got worried, and the cantor went over and whispered, "Are you all right?" And he said, "Yeah, I'm fine." And he left the pulpit. And after Yontif, he resigned the pulpit. And he went and sold life insurance for 6 months. Turns out he was even a worse life insurance salesman than he was a rabbi. And then he was invited to the Jewish Theological Seminary, where he came to become a great philosopher and radical revolutionary, and Harold Schulweis's mentor. Third story took place a year or two after Rabbi Schulweis got here. Yom Kippur, late afternoon. Family from VBS is sitting in the sanctuary. The teenage son of that family, I actually knew this boy because we were in USY together. The teenage son of this family had been invited to a party that night. And so he asked his father if he could leave the service and go to the party. And the father said, "Look, the service is almost over. Stay together. We'll be together as a family. And we'll hear the shofar blow together. And then you can go to your party." So he stayed through the end of the service. And they all experienced the blowing of the shofar at the end of the holiday. And the kid took his car, and by now it was very dark. And the party was in Malibu. And as he was driving over the canyon, he missed a turn and drove off the road and was killed. Rabbi Schulweis was at a break fast at someone's home and got interrupted immediately. They found him. And he left the break fast, got in his car, drove to that family's house, which was by now filled with friends. And they ushered him into the back bedroom where the father and mother were. And the father was sitting there weeping. And the father lifted his eyes as the rabbi entered the room, and the father screamed out, "Who let him into my house? You're not welcome here. Get out. Get out. You don't need to be here. Who let him in?" And the poor wife of this fellow, the mother of the kid who was killed, felt embarrassed even then. And she showed the rabbi out. And as she showed the rabbi out slowly, she said, "Listen, Rabbi, he's upset. Don't take it personally." But he did take it personally. He took it very, very personally. Because he knew that part of the fault, I mean, he certainly didn't cause this, obviously, but the fault was that he had taught a philosophy which he knew wasn't true. Where he knew that the experiences of life contradicted. And the philosophy, this idea, and the whole High Holidays is full of this, is this idea that there's a God who watches out for us. And if there's a God who watches out for us, well, then these kinds of things shouldn't happen. And if these things kind of happen, it's either because there's no God watching out for us, or that God simply doesn't care. This is what's called in philosophy and theology the problem of evil. E-V-I-L. It's a technical use of that term. It means suffering, when bad things happen to good people. Now, Schulweis realized very early in his career that this wasn't an ordinary problem for a theology, a problem for religion. I mean, answering the question, who wrote the Torah, is a problem for religion. Answering the question of, are we a chosen people, is a problem for religion. Answering the question, does God hear our prayers, is a problem for religion. This is a whole other thing, because this is exactly what religion is supposed to do. This isn't just a problem. This is the problem which religion is supposed to solve. The Torah begins with the words, Breshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. Because that's exactly what religion is supposed to do. Religion is supposed to create an ordered moral cosmos where things make sense, where things happen according to some plan, some law, where things happen for reasons. So that if you ask, why me, there's a reason why you, or why me, or why us. But the world doesn't behave that way. Even the Bible knew this at the beginning. So in the book of Deuteronomy, we're told that there's a God who rewards and punishes. And right away, there's a book called Job, which for some reason we Jews never read. And the book of Job is an extended meditation on this very question. Why do bad things happen in this world if there's a God who is good and a God who is caring? And at the end of the book, there really isn't a resolution. And the tradition wrestled with this problem, as did Rabbi Schulweis. And he was obsessed with it. It was one of the themes of his entire religious career. His first job, in addition to being the youth director in a synagogue in the South Bronx, his first job was as a philosophy instructor at City College. And he and his teaching partner created a textbook. It's actually the first textbook published in America on the philosophy of religion. And Schulweis wrote the chapter on why things happen to good people. He wrote his doctoral dissertation on this. We're going to read some of it. Well, we're going to try to read some of it. And it obsessed him. It was an obsession of his. Now, why was it an obsession? For three reasons. Reason number one, Schulweis was born in 1925, which means he comes of age as the Holocaust is happening. And he's living in the Bronx, where everyone speaks Yiddish and everyone has family in the old country. And everyone is getting rumors and reports and the frustration. And then as the facts of the Holocaust come clear, it completely shakes him, as it shakes all of us, as it shakes all of us. How do you justify a belief in a God who is good and caring, a God who is powerful and generous, a God who watches out for God's people? And the destruction of 6 million Jewish souls, 1 million Jewish children. How on earth do you make sense of that? In 1961, a philosopher, a rabbi named Richard Rubinstein, who had graduated seminary with Harold Schulweis, wrote a very famous essay that he turned into a very famous book called After Auschwitz. He was really the first one, really the first post-Holocaust theologian, if you can call it that. Take a look on your sheet. This is a selection from Rubinstein's answer to the question. I believe, Rubinstein writes, I believe that the greatest single challenge to modern Judaism arises out of the question of God and the death camps. How can Jews believe in an omnipotent, that means all-powerful, beneficent, that means all good, God after Auschwitz? Traditional Jewish theology maintains that God is the ultimate omnipotent actor in the historical drama. Everything happens because God wanted it to happen. It has interpreted every major catastrophe in Jewish history as God's punishment of a sinful Israel. The prophet Jeremiah said that the first temple was destroyed because the people were sinful and God sent the Babylonians to punish them. I fail to see how this position can be maintained now, under these circumstances, with this catastrophe, without regarding Hitler and the SS as instruments of God's will. If Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian emperor, was Jeremiah's idea of punishing a sinful Israel, can you imagine the idea that Hitler and the SS were sent by God to punish sinful Jews? To see any purpose in the death camps, the traditional believer is forced to regard the most demonic, anti-human explosion in all history as a meaningful expression of God's purposes. The idea is simply too obscene for me to accept. Camus, Alfred Camus, the great French existential writer, refuses to see man as inevitably and inescapably guilty before God. He accepts the tragedy, the inevitability, and the gratuitous absurdity of suffering, but he refuses to consent to its justice. In other words, Camus said, I would rather live in a godless world where random things happen than to imagine that the suffering I'm seeing in front of me is somehow God's will. Because a God who could make that or tolerate that would have to be so indomitably sadistic that I can't believe in that. Rubinstein's going to agree with him. Rubinstein's going to agree. He accepts the tragedy, the inevitability, and here's the word, the gratuitous absurdity of suffering. But he refuses to consent to its justice. He would rather live in an absurd, indifferent cosmos in which men suffer and die meaninglessly, but still retain a measure of tragic integrity, than to see every last human event encased in a pitiless framework of meaning, which deprives men even of the consolation that suffering, though inevitable, is not entirely merited or earned. We concur, that means we agree, with this choice of an absurd and ultimately tragic cosmos. That's Elisha ben Abuya, late din v'late dayan. I can't believe in a God who has any influence on human affairs, knowing that I know what happened at Auschwitz. That's what Rubinstein argues. And I would rather live in a godless, absurd, random world where evil happens than imagine that there's a God that actually did this on purpose. Now that's a pretty radical thing to say, and you see the way he sets it up. He's not going to let us escape. He's going to hold us by the throat. And of course, this was a very, very, very controversial article. Very controversial piece. We concur in this choice of an absurd, ultimately tragic cosmos. So people said, well, then how come you're a rabbi? And he said, it is precisely because human existence is tragic, ultimately hopeless, and without meaning, that we treasure our religious community, because there we can and share in a depth and dimension which no secular institution can match. Rubinstein said, I maintain my affiliation with religion because religion is the way we hold hands in the darkness. But the idea that he says, I can't live in a world with a God anymore. If this is what's going to happen in front of me, it's exactly what Elisha ben Abuya said. Harold Schulweis was touched by the same absurdity, the same pain of the Shoah, the same radical evil touched Harold Schulweis. This is what Schulweis wrote. To know me, to know us, is necessarily to understand the Holocaust. The Holocaust remains the dominant psychic reality of our lives. But here's his problem. Do I want to choose what Rubinstein chose? Am I prepared to give my kids a cold, dark, indifferent, absurd world? Would I do that to my own children? Would I do that to the children in my community? Schulweis had a problem because he knew that while Rubinstein has the problem down perfectly, his answer, his solution, leaves a lot wanting. You can't live in such a world. You can't make a day through such a world. You can't live without hope. And so he says, it is clear that children must know it all. And yet I wonder whether in transmitting the memory of the Holocaust, I lay a stone on their hearts. So you hear what he's saying? Rubinstein isn't wrong about his assessment of theology. But his answer can't be the answer, because it leaves us no light in a dark world. No hope, no moral order whatsoever. And I don't want to leave that to my kids. Do I plant in them, that's the children, the seeds of cynicism? Do I inadvertently rob them of the possibility of a normal, healthy relationship with the non-Jewish world and elsewhere? So the question is, how do I bring together some sort of a belief that leaves me with some hope and some light with the reality of the Shoah? So in his book, the book was his doctoral thesis on this problem that he wrote in 1971, was published in 1984. I will warn you, it's practically unreadable. The last chapter is readable. The rest of it makes good Purim reading because it's very difficult. At the end of the first chapter, where he lays this out, he leaves us with a quotation. And the quotation's from Elie Wiesel, who you all know was a survivor of Auschwitz and a chronicler, a witness to Auschwitz. And he leaves us with this quotation, this little epigraph. Elie Wiesel, hearing the story of Sarah, a prostitute and tormented victim of the death camps, Wiesel's hero cries out, quote, "Whoever listens to Sarah and doesn't change, whoever enters Sarah's world and does not invent new gods and new religions deserves death and destruction." So what Schulweis decides to do is exactly that. Invent a new god and a new religion. That was his first motivation in taking on this problem. The second motivation in taking on this problem is the life of a congregational rabbi. And he learned this very early. One of his very earliest published pieces in 1957, Rabbi Schulweis wrote a piece in the Reconstructionist magazine called Theology and the Pastoral Situation. And he talks about the fact that a rabbi, on almost a daily basis, is dealing with people in crisis. You don't have to have something as radical as a Shoah to know that people suffer, and they suffer terribly. And the question, why me, is asked all the time. All the time. And that the theology that's left us by the tradition sticks in his throat. That second story from Mordechai Kaplan is important, because Schulweis learned from Kaplan, and it was his own predilection in addition, not to say things he didn't believe in. And I've had the same experience. I got to testify to you. At the graveside, there is a Jewish blessing that we say when we tear Kriya. Baruch Dayan Emet. Blessed is the righteous judge. And there's even a prayer that follows it that sort of justifies everything God does. Now that's fine if someone's 112 years old and their great-great-grandchildren and it was time. Sometimes that feels okay. But you know what? I don't want to believe that death is a judgment. Because I've had to do services for too many people. And it's not a judgment. So Schulweis stopped saying it. He stopped saying a lot of prayers. Somewhere after the, I think, 10th or 12th year he's here, he got a letter from a member of the shul, which he then republished in his book, For Those Who Can't Believe. Here's the letter. Dear Rabbi, this is a real letter from a real congregant. Until this morning, I have spent the high holidays, if not in a spirit of fear and trembling before a God of justice, at least in the sure knowledge that it's appropriate to review my actions of the past year and give real thought to my failures and to resolve to be a better person and a better citizen. Until this morning, I knew the central liturgy of the holiday well. But before this year, I had approached it in an abstract, intellectual manner. This year, I could not do so. Several months ago, I had surgery for cancer, and I felt very keenly as I approached these days that in a real sense, my fate for the coming year has been written, if not in a book of judgment, then in my own body. I look forward to health, but I may not be granted it. As I read, the questions of the service were familiar. How many shall pass away, and how many shall be born? Who shall live, and who shall die? But the response, repentance, prayer, and righteousness avert the severe decree, for the first time carried a terrifying implication. It seemed to me as I read this that my own liturgy, that is the service, was binding my fate to my behavior. And that my illness, seen in this light, have been the result not of some terrible unknown transgression, a sin, and that the ultimate punishment for failure to discover and correct it could be my death. I do not believe this. Not with my head nor with my heart. Nevertheless, as a committed Jew who takes language seriously and believes in community prayer, I would be forced to repeat the central cornerstone over and over should I attend services for Yom Kippur. It seems today that my choice is a terrible one. To flagellate myself emotionally by joining my congregation, or spare my feelings by isolating myself from my family, friends, and community. It is a choice I never believed I would have to make. I know there must be others in the congregation who sit suffering silently, as I did today, who wish to join Jews around the world at this time, but find the price too high to pay. I do not write expecting an easy answer. Holocaust literature has taught me there may be no answer at all. I write instead because I must. Because to muffle my sadness and my anger will destroy something in the commitment that I worked so hard to build. I write with pain, hoping that from the expression of my dilemma will grow some insight, some way to cope with affection and respect. A real letter. And in case you don't know, we get those letters every year. I gave a sermon once on this because my mother, she never wrote letters. My mother had a better strategy. My mother simply left the shul. I mean, when that prayer came up, she'd say, oh, I got to go check the kitchen. I said, Mom, it's Yom Kippur. They're not serving anything. She said, I got to go check the kitchen. And she'd split. And I asked her once, like, where are you going? She said, I can't say that prayer. I won't say that prayer. And I won't sit there, you say that prayer. The prayer's here on the top of the next page. And you all know this prayer. You all know what it says. The situation of a congregational rabbi is to deal on a daily basis with suffering and with the question of why. Over and over again. That was the second thing that motivated the rabbi. The third thing, you need a page? You need one? You come on. The third thing that motivated him is something he never spoke about. In fact, he wouldn't tell me about. It was Malka who told me this. The rabbi's youngest daughter, Alyssa, was born with a very serious heart defect and spent the first months and years of her life in hospitals. And Malka and Harold, the rabbi and his wife, traded off night after night after night, sitting with that baby in the hospital, praying that she keeps breathing. And they were on a ward. Malka told me this story. They were in a section of the hospital, a pediatric cardiology section of the hospital. So all the rooms were filled with parents holding the hands of their baby children, praying that they keep breathing. And that had it had such a profound effect on Harold Schulweis that he would never talk to me about. I asked him about it. He wouldn't talk to me. She talked to me about it. Malka talked to me. She said he was blown away by this. So you're the rabbi. You believe in a God who makes things happen in the world. And your own kid is lying here suffering. She's okay, by the way. She was here the other night. She was here in December. She's okay. She's a mom. She's a writer. She's a therapist. But for those years, this young father was traumatized. These three things turned him toward this problem as the problem of his rabbinate. And he decided, having spent, and that's why he went to study. He was in Berkeley. And in Berkeley, there's a wonderful institution called Graduate Theological Union. It's a set of schools of religion. Pacific School of Religion is the non-denominational one. He enrolled there, and he spent 10 years figuring this problem out. And he wrote his doctoral dissertation. And in the doctoral dissertation, he came to the conclusion that there is no way to figure this one out. There's no clever answer to this problem. The name for this in philosophy, theology, is called theodicy, the justification of what God does. And typically, you've all heard these things because you go to services and you listen, and the rabbi or the preacher, the minister, the priest will say something along the lines of, we can't know the thoughts of God, but we have to trust that God has all things in his, and And the frustration of that, of course, is number one, you rabbis have so much to say and you can't give me an answer to the one question I ask you, right? And number two, what answer could there be? I'm going to make it warmer in here. I know that it's chilly. I'm chilly, so you're going to get warmer now. Sorry. I have this thing on my phone. You get it when you get ordained a rabbi. And it allows you to warm up the room. All right, that should do it. Okay, that should do it. It'll be, the problem here, for those of you who are visiting, is that the HVAC system that we put in, it has a toggle switch. It's either Antarctica or Sahara. Meat locker or steam bath. So this is meat locker, steam bath is coming. You'll be complaining about that in a minute too. It's going to get warmer in here in a minute, I promise you. The problem, Schulweis says, is whenever you pose the question, it's evaded. Because there is no answer to the question. This is his answer. Look at page 2. Ready? Once I conceive of God as a person. So when I think about God as a somebody, him, our Father who art in heaven, he becomes open to criticism. So you're God, and you're all powerful, and you're all good, so explain this stuff to me. If God is to retain his sovereignty, his vulnerability to criticism must be shielded. Here enter the religious doctors, who in their defense of God insist upon differentiating God from human beings. God hears, God thinks, God feels, God acts, but not as we hear and think and feel and act. God is not like us. God is different not only in degree but in kind. God is all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good. These are not the attributes that humans understand when referring to such qualities. So you say, God is all-powerful and God is all-good, but still these bad things happen. So it must be that God's idea of goodness is different than mine. I believe that if you kill a child, you're a very bad person. And there really is no justification for killing a child or hurting a child. And yet, you're going to tell me that it's okay if God does it? You see what he's saying? What you end up doing is you say, well, there's a morality for heaven, but it's a different morality on earth. And if there's a different morality on heaven and earth, then what is this whole religion business about? Well, you're going to worship such a God. I'm a little more excited by this than Schulweis was. He was very calm about this. Because I just want you to understand how outrageous this is. He doesn't express outrage. I'm good at it. He doesn't. It's outrageous to him. The very moral distancing. Here, critically, it means that God cannot be said to be moral in the manner that we're moral. Right? But if God's not moral like we're moral, and God tells you to do something, why would you want to do it? It might be immoral. Right? And the very moral distancing from God, from ourselves, raises many resentments. We hear in it the outburst of the philosopher John Stuart Mill, not a Jew, but I will call no being good who is not what I mean when I apply the epithet to my fellow creatures, and if such a being can sentence me to hell I will go. Right? We have been, he says, I've tried every way in the world. I've tried every one of the answers you've always heard. God has a plan that we don't know. That's an answer. Or every answer you've heard. And all of them are evasions of the core problem. And so what Schulweis says ultimately is, I can't believe in that kind of God. So what kind of God can I believe in? If I can't believe in that kind of God, in that sense, Rubinstein is right. But I don't want to leave my kids living in a cold, dark, absurd, morally empty universe. So what am I going to do? And here we're going to discover the rabbi's answers to the question. And I'm going to suggest tonight that the rabbi answered it in 3 different ways, but they're all connected. You'll see the connections as we go through them. Number 1, here's the next paragraph. We have been taught to think of God as a noun. It names something. The word God is somebody, right? To protect that noun from human moral criticism, like how could you do that, God? The qualities that describe it cannot retain the meaning they have for us in everyday use. The qualities of God's love, justice, and compassion, we are told, are not ours. The price for making the God noun invulnerable to human judgment is, in effect, to free it from any and all moral qualifications. So the preacher says to you, we must believe that God knows what he's doing, even though it looks to us grossly immoral. That's outrageous. I mean, if you ever hear a minister or rabbi say that, you take off your shoe and throw it at him. You have my permission. Because that's outrageous. That's just outrageous. Right? So what does he say? The price for making the God noun invulnerable is to free it from any and all moral qualifications. The noun stands detached from verbs, adverbs, and adjectives. Consequently, the human divine discourse of the dialogue is broken. So what are we going to do? So I'm going to give you 3 different answers. Here's answer number 1. Ready? And these are radical. And I'm not sure they were. At the end, I'm going to tell you what's wrong with them, but we'll get to them. Okay, ready? Imagine the following scenario. A college classroom. The instructor writes on the board, on the blackboard or whiteboard, 2 columns of propositions. Here they are. Column 1, God is just, God is merciful, God uplifts the fallen, God heals the sick, God loosens the fetters of the bound. Column 2, doing justice is godly, acting mercifully is godly, uplifting the fallen is godly, healing the sick is godly, loosening the fetters of the bound is godly. The instructor asks the kids in the room, young people in the room, how many of you believe in column A? How many hands go up? A few, tepidly, right? And the instructor says, why? Why don't you believe in column A? And someone bravely says to the instructor, because God is just and God is merciful. But then why is the world so full of suffering and brokenness? God uplifts the fallen and heals the sick. Why is the world so filled with disease? It's hard to believe that, given the empirical reality that we see every day. Then the instructor says, how many people believe in column B, in the propositions of column B? And every hand goes up. And the instructor says, why? This kid said, well, if you take the word godly to mean of ultimate value, then of course, doing justice is of ultimate value. Healing the sick is of ultimate value. Loosening the fetters of the bound is of ultimate value. Schulweis uses this example to explain what he calls predicate theology. Predicate meaning the end of the sentence. Here's the explanation. We'll go through this carefully. We have been taught to think of God as a noun. We said that before. Look at the next paragraph. I propose a shift of focus from noun to verb. And by the way, just for your edification, I've taught this to kids. Grown-ups have a hard time with this. Kids have no trouble with this whatsoever. 4th graders, I say, what's a noun? Oh, person, place, or thing. How many people think God is a noun? Every hand goes up. Okay, what's a verb? Something you do. What if God is a verb? All the kids go, ooh. I say, yeah, the whole idea, whether you believe in God or not, how many people believe we have to do a good job at Godding today? Every hand says, cool, what is Godding? I said, well, let's figure out. Give me an example of Godding. Kid says, taking care of my little brother, being nice to my mother, learning math, right, all Godding. Kids get this right away. Grown-ups are so hung up. Kids, much more fun. I propose a shift of focus from noun to verb, from subject to predicate, from God as person to godliness, in Hebrew Elohut. Not the qualities of divinity, but the divinity of the qualities is essential to belief. All right, now, what does he mean by that? Here's what he means by that. Take a bracha. You all know brachot, right? Let's take one everybody knows. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, hamotzi lechem min haaretz. That's what you say when you eat a meal, right? Praised are you, Lord God, whose presence fills the universe, or King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. Schulweis would ask us this question. What's more important, the beginning of the sentence or the end of the sentence? The beginning of the sentence says, I believe in a God who inhabits the whole universe. But the problem is it's really hard to believe in that God. Really, by the way, if that were what religion was about, then the sentence doesn't need a predicate. All you need is Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, period. That's it. Praise God. Hallelujah. Why do you put the predicate? What is this motzi lechem min haaretz business? And Schulweis would say, because the real purpose of that statement is not to focus on who God is, or where God is, or what God is, or how God is. It's to focus on the end of the sentence. To tell you that motzi lechem min haaretz, that feeding the hungry of the world and feeding yourself is an act of ultimate value. It is godly. Take any bracha and turn it upside down and read the end first. Healing the sick is godly. It's not that there's a God up there who's deciding, should this one get better and should this one stay sick and should this one not make it. There's a God up there who expects all of us to fight like hell against disease and make health real. It's godly. And this is his idea. Let's stop trying to qualify. Frankly, he said to me, it's not that I don't believe, he didn't believe in that God. But frankly, he said, even if I did, philosophically, there's nothing you can say about an infinite somebody. Because that's so far out of our experience. All I can say is what God does. And by the way, Maimonides agreed with him. Maimonides said there's absolutely nothing you can say about God except what God does and what God wants you to do, which is predicate theology in the 12th century. Look at the next paragraph. To believe in godliness is to believe in the verbs and adverbs that refer to the activities of divinity, the activities of God, the stuff God does. To believe in to behave in a godly fashion is to realize in one's life the attributes of godliness that are potential in all human and non-human energies. Atheism is not the disbelief in the reality and goodness of the noun, but the disbelief in the reality and goodness of the attributes. In other words, atheism is not to say, I don't believe there's a God in the universe. Atheism is to say, there's nothing in the world of ultimate moral value. There's nothing in the world worth giving your life for. There's nothing in the world worth fighting for. It's a statement of moral nihilism. The question is to be asked of those who seek God is not whether they believe in a noun that cannot be known, that's him up there, but whether they believe in the gerunds, that's the ing words, healing the sick, feeding the hungry, supporting the fallen, pursuing peace and loving the neighbor. Look, again, there are lots of people who run around the world telling you how ferociously religious they are and ferocious believers they are. They're even on television. And when you look at their behavior, they're morally disgusting. And you say, how can that be? How can you be such a God-filled person and yet look at the way you behave? And that's exactly what he's saying. I don't care what you believe in. How do you behave in the world? Your behavior tells me more about your theology than your statements of faith, your catechisms. Last paragraph. I know nothing of God as a noun. I can't tell you anything about who God is, where God is, what God is, how God is. All I can tell you is I know from the collective experiences of my people, recorded in sacred texts, and from my own experiences, only the gerunds, the verbs of God. Healing the sick, clothing the naked, housing the homeless, pursuing peace, loving my people and my neighbors. And I am bound to testify to the verbs of God by the adverbs of my conduct. God is behaved. That's a great line. God is behaved. Look at the way the person acts. Tell me if they're really religious. Don't tell me what they wear, where they pray, how long their beard is. Don't what church they're in. Just show me what they do. The arguments for God's existence and goodness are not furnished by inductive or deductive logic. The evidence is in our mouths, hands, and feet. Individually and collectively, we are the verifiers of God's reality. So look, what has he just done? He says the problem is that if you believe in him up there, then you have an absolute right to ask, well, why do kids get sick? Why is there a war? Why is there plague? Why are there accidents? Late dinva, late dayan. Why do kids fall out of rafters? And then you come up with all these really clever evasions. He said, I'm tired of clever evasions. I can't believe in him. What I can believe is what he's asked me to do. And if there's a him, I can't know anything about him, but I can know everything about what it means to live in this world and to live a godly life, to live a life of transcendent moral commitment. Transcendent moral commitment, moral absolutes, healing the sick, feeding the hungry, caring for the unhoused, protecting the vulnerable, making peace. Every time you make a bracha, what you're saying is, this thing that we do is important. That's the whole purpose of the epic. That's what religion is about. And that, for Rabbi Schulweis, was his experience of divinity. And now those of you who remember him, this is one of the most profoundly religious people I've ever met in my life. Maybe the most religious person. I've spent a lot of time with him. Because he really believed this, which is to say, he really believed that these things are godly and you must do them no matter what the consequences. There's a sense of kiddush Hashem, of martyrdom, of giving up things that, because he took stands on political issues and he said things in the community and he stood for things in the community that are very unpopular because he really believed that was right. And right is what God asks us to be. I mean, he really held to this. It's not, some people will dismiss this and say, oh, it's only secular humanism dressed up. There's no only in front of that. It's a commitment to transcendent moral values and a life of transcendent moral behavior. That was his first answer, because once I do that, now I don't have to worry. I don't have to answer the question, why did Auschwitz happen or why did my kid get sick? There are natural reasons, economic, political, and historical reasons for the Holocaust, and there are genetic and biological and biochemical reasons for disease. The question is, what are you going to do about it? How do you respond to this in the world? That's the question. So now, here's the second answer. The second answer was, where do I go to seek this God? And the second answer of Schulweis is inside. And here I want to introduce one more idea. So we'll read the text in a second. When you talk to rabbis, teachers of religion, theologians, they have a lot of fun phrasing problems in either-or terms. Either God wrote the Torah and gave it to Moses on Mount Sinai, and it has transcendent value, or human beings wrote it, and it's just another book. Either God hears our prayers and answers us, or prayer is just an absurd delusion. Either the Jewish people are the chosen people and endowed by God with certain prerogatives and privileges in the universe, or we're just another people crawling on the earth. Either or, either or. You hear lots of either-ors. Schulweis said, there's a problem with it. Whenever you hear an either-or, stop and listen for the missing middle. And the missing middle belongs to this idea of a God within. Of a God within. Look at the text. Everybody good with me? Where do I find God? How do I begin to pray? Begin with yourself. Because in Judaism, the self is regarded as the ultimate, unique, and indispensable link to God. Jewish thinking is rooted in the deepest, most revolutionary verse in the Bible, one that resonates throughout Jewish thought, the 27th verse, the second chapter of Genesis. And God created the human being in God's image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. Listen to that wisdom. There is a tselem, an image of God implanted in you. The image of God is found nowhere in the universe except in the human self in whom God breathed nishmat chaim. So there is God in you. So when you're praying, because people said to Schulweis, if all you believe is godliness, then what's prayer? He says, it's very simple. I'm trying to reach the God within. I'm trying to stimulate the God within. I'm trying to inspire and direct and guide and enhance and embrace the God within. So he always taught two things. Number one, he said, whenever you say a bracha, I did include it here. Whenever you say a bracha, add 2 words to the end of your bracha. Through me. Baruch atah Adonai cholei rofei amo Yisrael. Blessed is God who heals the people. That was your cue. Let me try that again. Blessed is God who heals human beings. Blessed is God who makes peace. Blessed is God who brings bread from the earth. You get the picture? What's the difference between the 2 propositions? If I say Baruch atah Adonai oseh shalom, or oseh shalom bimromav hu yaseh shalom aleinu, God who makes peace, I'm asking him to do it. I become a spectator. Yo, God, go for it. But once I add 2 words, what happens now? I'm obligated. I'm committed. I'm claimed. I'm responsible. Now it becomes personal. Now it's like, what? I have to do that? I have to do that? Yeah. That's the whole point. That's the whole point. It becomes personal. And you take the same theological question. Like, look at the questions. Does God really care? Do you care? Right? Does God raise the fallen? Do you raise the fallen? Does God intervene? Do you intervene? Does God hear your prayers? Do I hear my prayers? By putting God within, I solve all those either-or problems. Either God wrote the Torah or Torah is just another book. No, there's a middle one. I tell this to kids all the time. God wrote the Torah. Kids say, really? You believe God wrote the Torah? Every word. Only one thing. God doesn't own a pencil. What do you mean? God doesn't own a word processor. Created apples, but that's another thing. How did God write the Torah? What instrument did God use to write Torahs? Us. Sensitive, deep, thoughtful souls who lived their lives in the world and struggled and suffered and celebrated and sang and then wrote down holy words that they had discovered through the power of their experience, and that's what Torah is. Yeah, God wrote the whole Torah, and it's a human book. Does God hear our prayers? Yes, every single one. But you know how they get acted out in the world? You have to go do it. Because the God that hears your prayers is the part of you that needs to go take care of something. You need to go take. There's a very famous story of the Kotzker Rebbe. It was one of Rabbi Schulweis's favorites. And he noticed there was someone who was missing from shul. And he said to the Hasidim, where's Menachem? And they said, what do you, Rebbe, Menachem? Menachem comes, he doesn't come. He said, no, where's Menachem? And the Rebbe said, we don't know where Menachem is. How can you pray to God and not want you ask God to notice you and answer your prayers, and you didn't go look for Menachem this morning? You don't listen to the oh, thank God. McAllen 18. No, the question really is, what are we to each other? Do we hear our prayers? You see? This is Schulweis's second answer. Again, it's related to this notion of godliness because it puts a claim on me. And here's the third one. This one is the most complicated one, highly misunderstood. He said to us, this is the third answer. God is one, but it is significant that more than one name of divinity is used throughout the Bible. Two of the most prominent names of God, of divinity, are usually found side by side, are Elohim and Adonai, or Adonai Elohim, or Adonai Eloheinu, right? Elohim refers to the God of creation, the God of nature, the ground of natural law. Elohim is the cause of the world as it is. Elohim is the God of the reality principle, the way things are, not the way things ought to be, the God of the laws of gravitation in contrast to the laws of moral revelation. So here's what happens. Schulweis came up with this idea of godliness, predicate theology, in 1971 when he wrote his doctoral thesis. He published it many times, gave many sermons about it. And this idea that God is behaved, that we do God, this idea of through me, God within, that came a little bit later. And then he started having heart attacks. He had one, I don't know when the first one, in 1983 I think was one of the first ones, and he had bypass operation. And then he had another one in 93 when I came. Something happened to him. First of all, it made him a lot softer. He suddenly discovered poetry and emotions. But something else happened. He was so awed by the experience. He gave one of the most beautiful talks of his life, 1986, when he came out of the hospital. I know this because I was living in Texas and my father sent me the sermon. My father has a teeny little tape recorder. And it's a miracle that I got to hear Schulweis the day after he gave the sermon. But my dad would send me these tapes and I listened to it and it was just an awesome sermon. What happened was he came, and the whole experience of going into Cedars-Sinai and having this open heart surgery, and the skill of the physicians, and the remarkable technical miracle of giving him back life. And he came out with this idea that there's something missing from this godliness business, and that is the sense of God in nature. The sense of God in the majesty and power and glory of nature. So if you've ever gone to Yosemite and got up early in the morning, you want to pray. And if you ever stood by the ocean, you want to pray. And if a loved one has ever been really sick and a doctor figured it out and made you better, you want to pray. Because there's something there. And so he comes up with this idea of, yes, there's godliness, and that's going to be represented by Adonai, the word Adonai. Because Adonai, it comes into the Bible only with people. It's in the second chapter of Genesis, when people are created, that Adonai is called. The other name for God is Elohim, which refers to nature. So the nature God, the God of nature is not moral. I mean, the earthquakes will drop the houses of rabbis and anyone else. I can testify to this. Right? The God who creates firestorms in Pacific Palisades doesn't discriminate between righteous and unrighteous. Elohim is nature. It's the glory and majesty and beauty of nature. And it represents what is. But Adonai represents what ought to be. Here's the second paragraph. The face of Elohim reveals only part of the... Let me finish this one. Elohim is the cause of the world as it is. Elohim is the God of the reality principle. The way things are, not the way things ought to be. The God of the laws of gravitation in contrast to the laws of moral revelation. Right? So, late din v'late dayan, Elisha ben Abuya was right. God did cause that kid to fall because God created gravity. And the kid fell because of gravity. Not because it was right or wrong, just because gravity makes things happen and doesn't make exceptions, even for kids. The face of Elohim reveals only part of the persona of divinity, that is God. Adonai is the other half. The countenance of Adonai, that is the face of God, moves us to transform the givenness of nature that weighs heavily upon us. It is the counsel of Elohim leads to acceptance. The urging of Adonai calls for transformation. Adonai relates to human nature, make due to control and repair nature. Elohim is the source of power of nature. Adonai is the ground of moral goodness. The two dimensions of divinity belong together. Elohim, the God of nature, Adonai, the Lord of morality. Elohim, the God of necessity, Adonai, the Lord of possibility. Elohim, the God of what is, Adonai, the Lord of what ought to be. Elohim, the God of acceptance, Adonai, the God of transformation. Their unity embraces the oneness of reality. Ought is as real as is. So what is he trying to say? When I go to Yosemite and I wake up early in the morning and I feel the majesty of the place, or when I go down to the ocean, or when I hold my grandson in my arms, there's a feeling of divinity there. But it's not a moral divinity. It's just the God of what is, and it's magnificent. But when I witness moral courage and moral goodness, the transformation of what is, that doctor who showed up and saved my life with his skill and his commitment and his care, and showed up at my bedside every morning at 5:30 in the morning to make sure I'm okay and adjust my meds, that's a different God. That's Adonai. That's the transformation. That's the godliness. And I can recognize both. And the purpose of Jewish monotheism is to bring the two together. Shema Yisrael, listen up, you Jews. Adonai Eloheinu. which means that our vision of what the world ought to be is just as real as our understanding of the world as it is. That's what the two together mean. And the two together mean we have to take seriously the way the world is, and we have to take seriously, deadly seriously, the way we fight for a world that ought to be, and both belong together. Both belong to, and sometimes you have to hear the voice of Elohim that tells you to accept. Sometimes you've got to accept that there's nothing that can be done and take the moment at its givenness. And sometimes you've got to fight like hell and make it better. And that's the great wisdom of faith. This is, I think, better expressed in his poetry than in his prose. So turn the page, and I gave you a snippet of his poem. And you can read this. Elohim creates day and night, light and dark, lion and lamb, bacteria and penicillin, gives power to the fowl above the earth, to the great sea monsters below, to every living creature that creeps on the earth. And Elohim said, it is very good. All existence is good in the eyes of Elohim, the God of the first chapter of Genesis. Elohim, before whom we bow our heads and bend our knee, the sovereign God whose power and reality we accept. But Elohim is not the whole of divinity. Alongside Elohim is Adonai. This is our affirmation of oneness. Hear, Israel, Adonai is Elohim. Adonai, our Elohim, is one. Adonai, the Lord of all that ought to be. Adonai revealed in the yearning and behavior of his creatures for justice, for fairness, peace, and harmony. Adonai in the vision of compassionate society. Adonai in the transformation of chaos and violence and the void of the universe into order, sanity, and love. Adonai in the mending of the universe, the repair of the world, the binding of bruises, the gathering of fragmented sparks buried in the husks of the world. Adonai revealed in the discovery of self, created in the image of Adonai Elohim, the Lord God, who breathed into our nostrils and made us a living soul. Elohim Adonai, Adonai Elohim, acceptance and transformation. The reality of what is, the reality of what ought to be, the reality of what is yet to be. It's a very complicated idea. And he got a lot of flack for this because it sounded like two gods. But he always insisted this is one. But because of this, now we can understand one more piece of Rabbi Schulweis's program. Elohim is this. It's everything around us, and we can see that it's real. To find Adonai, you have to look harder. To find Adonai, you have to see moral courage, moral selflessness, moral sacrifice, moral action. You have to see it in the behavior of human beings. That's where Adonai lives. That's the God within. But if this is God, God has to be all the time. It has to be real. There can't be a thing, a place, a circumstance which is free of God. This is his ultimate refutation of Richard Rubinstein. But there was a place that had no God in it. It's called Auschwitz and Treblinka and Majdanek and Dachau and Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald. There was a place. There was no God. And that makes the whole theory difficult. Because where was God? Where is your Adonai? I can see Elohim. Elohim are the social forces that create genocide. But where is Adonai? Where's the transformation? Where's the ought to be? And that's when Harold Schulweis met Fritz Graeber, the maintenance director of the San Francisco Fairmont Hotel. We talked this last week. We ended with this last week. He was doing a dinner, and Benjamin Swig, who owned the hotel, loved this young rabbi and said, I want you to meet an extraordinary person. And he introduces him to this great big giant guy wearing a coverall. Tell him your story. And Fritz Graeber tells the rabbi his story. That he was a contractor, a defense contractor for the Nazis. He was a member of the Nazi Party. And he witnessed what the Nazis were doing to Jews in Eastern Europe, and it broke his heart that the great German nation was participating in the greatest crime in all of human history. And he decided to do something. And he started pulling Jews off of trains and out of ghettos and out of lines that led to death and put them in his company and put them on his company manifests. And on the day that they caught him, or almost caught him, he had saved 5,500 Jewish people. And then he ran to the Allies, and they jailed him for a while, and then realized who he was, and they made him a translator, and he came back, and he testified, and he moved to San Francisco to get away from the animosity of his neighbors. And Benjamin Swig gave him a job at the Fairmont Hotel. And Harold Schulweis said, "What did we ever do to thank you?" And Graber said, "I don't want any thanks." And Schulweis decided this was his calling. But now understand something. It's not just that this was the right thing to do. Absolutely it was the right thing to do. And he set up this organization called the Foundation for the Righteous, which has now found 10,000 rescuers and sends hundreds of thousands of dollars and packages to rescuers. There are very few of them left, but over the course of the last decades, they've sent hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars to support them. Many of them found themselves excluded and alienated from their communities because they helped Jews. And of course, Yad Vashem has a whole avenue celebrating these people. But it's more than just the right thing to do. It saved his theology. Because if I believe in godliness, if I believe there is a God within, if that's Adonai, that which claims a human being to do what is good and godly and right in the world, then it has to be found in all circumstances. And when he found it in the ghettos and concentration camps of Eastern Europe, he could honestly say, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. That moral courage and moral goodness and the power of moral transcendence is just as real as the hard facts of the universe we live among. Because even in Auschwitz, there were those who saved Jewish lives. And in the ghettos, and in the cities, and on the trains. And they were ordinary people. They were not great heroes. They wanted nothing. We used to bring them here all the time, and they wanted nothing. Remember, we had a young man who had been a policeman in Copenhagen. And he was one of those who took Jewish kids, Jewish families down to the port, paid off the fishermen to float them across to Sweden during the war. And then in the daytime, he was a policeman in Copenhagen, and the Nazis didn't catch on. He survived, came to Orange County, he runs a printing company. And we said, "You deserve an award." He said, "I deserve nothing. These were friends. These were human beings. These were fellow Danes." Like the humility of these people. Fritz Graber didn't want anything. So for Schulweis, the fact of moral rescuers, of course, there were many, many, many more torturers than rescuers. And of course, there weren't nearly enough rescuers. And of course, but the fact that there were any at all means that Adonai is real. That the power of moral transcendence is real in the world and needs to be celebrated. And this was his answer to Richard Rubinstein. I can acknowledge the horror of the Shoah and teach it to my kids without destroying their sense of faith in the world, because I can point to an Oskar Schindler and a Raoul Wallenberg and a Sempo Sugihara and a Fritz Graber. And to the Crown Princess of Bulgaria, and to the Chief Bishop of Athens, and on and on and on. That in every community, in every place in Europe, there was somebody who said, "Come in, I'll shelter you." And for Harold, for Rabbi Schulweis, that meant that I can see in human moral courage the hand of God. That's where he saw God in the world, and that was sufficient. He didn't need a burning bush or a splitting sea or frogs coming from the sky. He met a very humble man in the Fairmont Hotel who risked his life to save 5,500 Jews. That's how Harold Schulweis answered the great question. Yes, there is suffering in this world. No, God didn't make it happen. But where is God in a world where there is suffering? In those strong and powerful and loving souls who step forward and say, "Dear God, heal the world through me." Last point. It didn't exactly work. And at the end of the book, he makes a very strange confession, which was not like him. The name of his book is For Those Who Can't Believe. That wasn't the original name of the book. The original name of the book was When You Get Older, You'll Understand, which is what his grandfather used to always say when he used to ask questions. He'd say, Zeta, why does this happen? And Zeta would say, you'll understand when you get old. But then the editor decided For Those Who Can't Believe is a better name, and it's a brilliant name, and the book sold a lot of copies. But in the last chapter, the book is set up as a dialogue between him and an imaginary interlocutor named David, who's a young person who has trouble believing. And Schulweis goes through the whole book, 11 chapters, telling him, here's how you can believe. And in the end of the book, he says, David, don't buy it. It's kind of a strange, you write a book for those who can't believe, and in the last chapter you say, he still doesn't believe. And here's what he writes. Why, David asks, should I be religious? Schulweis answers, I have sought to remove the obstacles to his faith by acknowledging some of the shortcomings of conventional theology and by offering alternative interpretations of belief within tradition. David remains ambivalent. That's a nice way of putting it. He is drawn to the many options I've proposed, but he has reservations about the authenticity of these new interpretations. And here's the answer. Paradoxically, the only religious notions he considers authentic are those he cannot believe. And the only ones he can believe are those he thinks to be inauthentic. And every time Rabbi Schulweis taught his theology, godliness, gerunds, Adonai Elohim, he got the same response from audiences. I used to go with him and watch. And I could predict what the questions were going to be. Because people would say, yes, but what about the God we talk to all the time? I just finished an hour and a half telling you why and it didn't help. Because there's something that he understood it. Here's how he understood it. He says, Schulweis, he said, David doesn't accept this because David is immature in his religious development and is holding on to his childish religion. That's kind of snarky. I had a better answer. Two answers. Number one, people don't want a completely rational religion. Right? Sunday through Friday, we live in a rational world of the New York Times and the Washington Post and CNN and Fox News and MSNBC, and it's rational and it's difficult and we watch it. One day a week I come to shul. I want a break from that. I actually want to go someplace where I can be a little enchanted. Right? I want a little enchantment. I want an escape from the rational world that disgusts me Sunday through Thursday. I want a little something. I want to go back. I want to either go back to a simpler kind of faith, or I want to live in an enchanted universe where there's a God who's taking care of me. That's one. And Schulweis did not understand this. He thought this was magical. He's right. I mean, he never got this. Someone asked me last week about how things have changed, Brian. One of the ways is that in the 1990s, people started talking about spirituality and religious experience, and he just got none of it. He just thought it was all nonsense, really nonsense. And it was really funny. I'll tell you why. Some of you remember this, because the other big religious personality was a man named Shlomo Carlebach, who was this mystical rabbi. He used to come with a guitar, and people, and the girls would flock, and Schulweis like, what is this? And all of his theology couldn't match the fervor of Shlomo Carlebach, you know? I had another explanation, which I put in my book, where I said, this is a generational difference. Schulweis is a modernist. He's rejecting tradition and giving us a rational, modern way of thinking about God. And it's perfectly logical. David, the next generation, is postmodern. And postmodern means you can have contradictory identities layered one on top of the other without feeling compunctions, So my friend who is a feminist, ferocious feminist, davens at Chabad. And I say to her, She said, yeah, I just really like the atmosphere there. I said, but I didn't even have words for it. I just, like, I said, but I like it there. And I know what she means. Postmodern philosophy, postmodern identity allows you to have multiple, even contradictory identities at the same time. So she likes to go to Chabad because she likes a dose of old-time religion, but she would never buy that as a personal philosophy. And she likes what I teach here, but she doesn't feel like this is like touches her heart. Okay. And I used to argue with Schulweis all the time. I said, you know, what you're teaching people is really rational. It's just not what their heart wants. It's what their minds want, but not their hearts, and that's a problem. But now the question he's going to come back with, I think, is a perfectly legitimate question. It's what we started with. Don't take it personal, Rabbi. It is personal. And the beliefs that we hold on to shape a world we live in. And if those beliefs aren't real, they're not rational, they're not careful, you can hurt people. And that kind of religious life, he was worried about that. That's what he worried about. But once again, he lived this with all of his heart. And next week, when we gather again, we'll do some questions in a minute. But next week, I want to show you how he lived it. Because he brought a very unique idea of why we Jews are in the world. And that'll be next episode. Let's take a moment, and anyone have questions? I'm delighted to try to answer them or try to evade them cleverly. But thank you all for listening, and it's really cold outside, so be really careful. It's even early, my God. Okay, who's up? Jeff.
So thank you for elucidating us tonight. One is a comment that in his predicate theology, if all of these actions are godly, and that's column B, then all of those actions actually are part of column A. So they
well, that's
by
his
that
point.
definition have to merge.
Right. His point is column B is really, column A is a metaphor for column B. I used to ask him all the time, if you believe in this godliness business, why don't we write a new prayer book?
Yeah.
Why do you use the old prayer book? And his answer was, you don't have to. We just have to read it right. He read theological statements about God as a metaphor for his notion of godliness.
And then one last question.
Plus, I think, the other thing is, apropos what we said a moment ago, there was a bit of a chassid in him. He wouldn't admit it.
Did he ever have a relationship with Rabbi Harold Kushner?
Oh, yeah, they're very close.
When he
Kushner came out of seminary 10 years after Schulweis. Kushner was the other great student of Mordechai Kaplan, who made it big. He and Kushner knew each other, respected each other deeply. They had never met each other until I brought them here in 1980. Right? When Schulweis, in 1980 or 85? 85. When Rabbi Schulweis turned 80 years old, we were trying to figure out what do we do for him. You know, typically when someone gets an award, you find a bigger Jew than they are to give them the award, you know? So if they're a big guy, you get the president of something or the chairman of something or the rabbi of something. But who do you get to give Harold Schulweis an award? So I had this crazy idea. I wanted to bring the 5 greatest teachers of Judaism in the world together in the same room to celebrate him. So I went to him and I said, here's my idea of the 5 greatest Jewish teachers. Who do you think? And we were pretty close. And so we had Harold Kushner, Yitz Greenberg, David Hartman, David Ellenson, and Harold Schulweis in the room at the same time. Hartman at the last minute couldn't come because he was having heart trouble, but he sent us a beautiful video. And the others came, and Kushner and Schulweis had never met before, but they knew about each other a lot. And they really had they really were very close. And Kushner's philosophy is a little bit different than Schulweis's, but on the same track. If you read When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And the first thing you got to know is the title of the book is not why things happen to good people, it's when things happen to good people, because that's exactly the same idea. I'm not going to answer the why question, because the answer to the why question is stuff happens. The answer to the when question is, what do we do next? That's where God lives. That's Kushner's philosophy in a nutshell, and that sounds very familiar from Rabbi Schulweis's philosophy as well. Okay? Is that clear? Okay.
Rabbi, mention how, before I ask a question, mention how the rabbinic schools closed.
Yeah, well, what we did was, so you bring the 5 greatest Jewish teachers in the world in the same room. What are you going to do with them? So I had the second idea, which is equally crazy. We have 3 rabbinical schools. Well, now we have more, but we had 3 rabbinical schools in town: AJU, HUC, and AJR. So I called the deans of all of them. We're all friends of mine. And I said, what if you guys come and have breakfast? Better yet, why don't you come and pray with us? So they canceled class for the day, and they all came here. And we had about 200 rabbinical students, and we had a whole service. And the most beautiful thing about the service was Yitz Greenberg, who was an Orthodox rabbi, stayed in the service as women davened and read Torah, and he was beautiful. And then we had a panel discussion with all of them, which was really a treat. And, we don't have a lot of videotape of Maimonides from the 12th century, but we have this whole program on videotape, and you can watch it. Is it on the website? Yeah, go to hms.info, hmsi.info, Schulweis Institute, and you'll see the whole program there. And then I published it in a book and won a prize, and it never sold. And if you want a copy, we have many. We'd love to share them with you, get them out of the basement. So it was a wonderful experience to have 1980. 20 years ago, right? Yeah.
2005.
Someone can do math. That's Adonai. That's Elohim speaking. Please.
Okay, so this really isn't a question, but in a way it is.
Yeah.
When he spoke and he got rid of the capital G, God, over our heads, and presented the small g, the godliness, I think that our whole generation was transformed.
Yeah.
I really do. I know he saved me.
Because there was a whole generation of people like you, in some ways like me, but in some ways more like my parents, who had a deep, deep, deep attachment to Jewishness, but a real question about belief and religion. And he comes along and he gives you a religion you can believe in that answers, or at least doesn't face the question, doesn't have to wrestle with the question of why do bad things happen to good people. It happens to good people because that's the way the universe is set up, right? The answer is, what are you going to do about it? And puts the activism back in your lap and demands activism, demands responsibility and commitment from Jews, makes them active instead of passive. Look, he wrote a sermon once about prayer. I think it was your brother-in-law who asked him this question, because it's directed to George, so, right? So he asked the question. George says, why do I have to sit in synagogue and praise him all the time? Right? It's all about how great is God and how good is God and how wonderful is God. And this George asks him, like, what does that do? And so he uses this formula and says, the purpose of that statement is not just to butter him up. The purpose of that statement is to tell you what is good in the world and what you need to be doing. So go ahead.
Okay, the other question is, would you explain how he put in pray for the skill of the physician?
The what?
The skill of the physician. You mentioned it tonight.
Yeah. In that prayer?
In that prayer.
Yeah, what happened was, I went to a conference once, and part of the conference was about healing. And I wanted to do healing services here at VBS because I thought it was a really wonderful thing. We did some, and they were very touching, right? Sally was involved with this. So I went to him and I said, I really don't like the prayer for healing that we say, because the prayer for healing is all him. It's, it's Mishaberach Havazem, may the God who blessed our ancestors bless and heal so-and-so with wholeness of body and wholeness of spirit, and that's the name, that's the prayer. But that's not what we don't believe in that. Even the most traditional Jew doesn't pray until he goes to see the doctor, right? So I need one that reflects our theology that we are partners with God in bringing cure and healing to the world. So he wrote me a prayer. I love that. Someone could do that. And it's beautiful, right? And it's the one about blessed us at the sea and in the desert, bless and heal the ill of those who are sick in our community, through us your witnesses, right? Grant the skill of the physician. It's a beautiful prayer, and it acknowledges that we are involved in the process, that it is a partnership. It really is a prayer written in the theme of godliness, and it's a beautiful, beautiful prayer. Well, one of us still says it, so, yeah.
Rabbi, you were talking about how Rabbi Schulweis is a great rationalist, and the newer generation is more spiritual. But how can Rabbi Schulweis be such a wonderful poet then? Isn't there great spirituality
That's
in the
a great
poems?
question, Buzz. So as I suggested last week, he had what we religious people call revelation, and it came about because of his experiences with heart disease, and it opened him up, literally. I mean, if I say it opened his heart in both senses, it opened him up, and he gave a couple of really beautiful sermons about emotions, and he even confessed. He said, I was always taught that emotions were secondary and the mind and ideas were primary. And I realized that's not true, that there is a partnership between head and heart, that the harmony of head and heart is what's more important. And the poetry, he started writing this poetry as an expression of his emotions, of his feelings. And so it came about, and that in some ways mirrored and paralleled what was going on in the culture, where people were much more interested in religious experience, in religious, overwhelming religious experience, in the different kinds of services with lots more singing. You remember what his services? There was great music at Valley Beth Shalom in between his sermons. No, seriously, he would give like a 20, 30-minute introduction, and then Sam Fortis would sing a prayer. Then he'd give a 20-minute introduction, and Sam Fortis, and an hour and a half later, you'd said 3 prayers and heard 2.5 hours of the rabbi's, which is beautiful. It took him a long time to realize, let people feel something. And he came to that. He really came to understand that later in his life. It was also the birth of his grandchildren, I think. And grandchildren, he hated kids. He wouldn't let kids. There's a story early in his career here that some kid started squeaking in the middle of his Rosh Hashanah sermon. Ooh, he stopped and glared. That kid's a Catholic priest today. I could guarantee that mother don't belong to the shul no more. It was only when his own grandkids were born that he started allowing kids to sneak into the synagogue, and he got much softer with kids. And sometimes he was downright fun with kids, as long as he was in the right... he loved teenagers, terrific with teenagers, right? No, he would love the teenagers. I had a friend who was one of my friends, a colleague, was a rabbi, was a high school student, and we used to have this program, a high school program. He taught a high school class. I teach it now. And it was Halloween night. And this kid was the only kid who showed up to the class. There were like 25 kids enrolled in the class, and only Neil showed up. And the rabbi sat with him for an hour and a half. And he said, I'll never forget. It's the reason I'm a rabbi, the guy said, because Schulweis could have said, go home, I got more important things to do. But there was a kid who wanted to learn. And the greatest rabbi in North America sat with that young person for 90 minutes and learned together. And that young man is now a rabbi in the community because I learned what it means to be a rabbi. You teach, no matter what. Who had the mic? Hi.
Hi. Thank you, Rabbi
thank you.
Feinstein. These talks are just amazing. I
Thank
think
you
you
so
inspire each and every one of us.
Thank you.
And you impart wisdom.
Keep going. I need this.
You impart wisdom
been
that
a
I
really
think
lousy
we can all
week.
can grasp. We can grasp the wisdom. So
Thank you so much. Yeah.
I wanted to know your book, wait, hold on. I just
Yeah.
looked it up.
Yeah. Pursuit of godliness.
Yeah, The Pursuit of Godliness.
Yeah.
Do you think that is pretty much the summary of what you've been speaking
Yeah.
about these
Well,
last two?
it's a little more technical, and it's much longer. It's a very long book. But it's a little more technical than the stuff we're doing here, but it's all there. And if you want to read it and you have any questions, you can certainly call and ask. Read Schulweis. Get For Those Who Can't Believe and try to read it. It's a wonderful book. No, it's a wonderful, wonderful book. It's a really wonderful book. And if you have any questions about that, but it's a very readable book. And you'll hear his voice. And you'll see how he does it. Okay? I would do that rather than my book, then read my book afterwards if you want to read. Because there's a whole lot of stuff about like where he got these ideas from. that I spent a lot of time in that book on because it was an academic book. I wanted to write one. I've written like 2 children's books and 2 books of popular theology, and I wanted to write one academic book in my life, so I wrote that one. You know, obscure, difficult to read, overly verbose, academic, you know, and that's why it sold 20 copies. 18 to my father, and, you know. But I wanted to write one academic book in my life, and that's my academic book, so thank you very much. The rest of them are much more accessible. Yeah. Hey, Stanley.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you say a few words about Rabbi Max Vorspan, another student of Kaplan's who had his life in Los Angeles here and did so many things, and his theology and how you can work that in?
No. I love you, Stanley. I will give another series one day on great rabbis who lived in L.A., all right, but not tonight. Max Vorspan was an amazing, amazing, amazing teacher. He was the vice president of the University of Judaism, along with David Lieber, who was the president. He was an amazing teacher, an amazing thinker. He spoke so fast, I couldn't take notes in his class. Another time, we will spend a night or two on Max. His grandchildren belong here, so it's fun, you know.
Of course, his son is our rabbi.
I know, and we'll invite David to come, and we can do a night on Max Vorspan another night, but that's a whole nother story. Yes, please.
So does this mean that we are accepting that God is not omnipotent?
We are not accepting anything. I'm telling you what Schulweis believed and why he believed it. Now you have to figure this out. And you have to ask yourself, I think as a thinking, feeling person in the world, you have to ask yourself the kinds of questions he asked himself. Okay? Because here's the question. The religious person says, I believe in God, I believe that God is good, and I believe that God is powerful and caring, and I believe that God is watching out for me. And because of my belief in God, I have a sense of meaning and purpose in my life and moral vision. But then that runs into the problem of, well, then why is there suffering in the world, right? And that means either God isn't good, that is, God lets it happen, or God isn't powerful, God has to let it happen, he can't fix it, or there is no God. I mean, that really is how Richard Rubenstein put it at the beginning of his book. And Rabbi Schulweis is struggling with this because he doesn't want to say we live in a cold, empty, random universe. He wants to say moral goodness, moral courage, moral activism in the world is of transcendent value. It is sacred. It is powerful, and it is as real as any. It is as real to him as any mitzvah is for an Orthodox rabbi. Okay? And so for him, he's trying to say, how do I hold on to a sense of the meaningfulness of my existence and the fact that I live in a moral cosmos, even though these things happen? And the answer is not because the moral cosmos produces tragedies, because the cosmos produces sensitive people like you who are going to be there to heal people after the tragedy. Look, we had these firemen here the other day. My friend Sean, actually a member of our shul. First, the largest human being I know. He's been a fireman for 30 years. He almost killed in the fire because a piece of metal crashed through his fire engine. Look at what this guy does. This guy puts on a suit, a yellow jacket, picks up an axe, and stands between me and my kids and that conflagration and says, it won't touch you, I'm here. For Schulweis, that's godliness. There's something of transcendent moral value in courage, in giving, in selflessness. That's what he's trying to say. I can't believe in a God up there because there's too much suffering, but I can believe in people like this, and that's what I need to know that life is worth living, and that's the example. Do you see what he's doing here? He's trying to live in a moral cosmos with transcendent value without a transcendent God. That's what he's trying to do. Now, you have to decide, what do I want to believe in? And you don't have to decide, because it's okay. You can keep coming to shul and working it out. But that's the question. I want you to ask his question tonight, okay? Thank you. Thank you. Okay, other question? Where's the mic? Yes, please.
Most important prayer we say is the Shema 3
Yeah.
times a day. How did he handle the second paragraph?
Yeah. Well, the second paragraph meaning what? Vahayam Shema or V'ahavta?
That
Vayam Shmoah.
If you follow
Oh, yeah.
this, that you'll be healthy.
Again,
And
you've got to think
did
metaphorically.
he just skip that
No,
section?
no. Well, he did, but that's another one. He skipped a lot of things, because he had things to say. No, it's actually a very beautiful thing if you think of it. What does it say? If you devote yourself to godliness, and give of yourself selflessly to the world, doing all the things that the tradition teaches you are evidence of godliness, heal the sick, feed the hungry, bring housing to those vulnerable, protect the vulnerable, teach children. If you do that, no matter how much you spend of your own energy and resources, material and spiritual, on those efforts, you will always have enough. And you will always live with a sense of purpose and satisfaction and joy. But if you only hear the ego saying, I want, more, then no matter how much you might earn in this world, you will never have enough. You will always live a life of need and want and poverty. That's what the second paragraph of the Shema says. Because the Shema says, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai. Our power of transformation in the world is just as real and as consequential as the natural forces that shape the material world we live in. What ought to be is just as real and consequential as what is. And so, if you devote yourself to what ought to be, you'll live a life of satisfaction and joy. If you devote yourself to only the things that you want, you're never going to have enough. You're never going to have enough. And we all know those stories, right? The Torah, Pirkei Avot, has a beautiful saying. It says, "Im ein kemach ein Torah." That makes sense. If you don't have material sustenance, you're not going to have spirituality. Because if you're hungry, you don't want to talk about God. But then it goes on the other side. Im ein Torah ein kemach. If you don't have spiritual purpose in your life, then what good is your material prosperity? You're always going to want more. You're never going to be satisfied with what you have. And you're probably going to destroy yourself in the process. That's why I once make a sermon about People magazine. My wife, when she was writing her PhD, her mother, I think, gave her a subscription to People magazine. Everyone know what People magazine is? And the first time I looked, I said, what gossipy crap. How can you bring this into our home? It's horrifying. It's terrible. It's full of movie stars. Who needs it? And then I took it and I read it. First of all, it's wonderful because the magazines are just long, the articles just long enough to use in the bathrooms. If you can get through a whole issue of People out of the bathroom, go see your doctor. And I realized what People magazine is a profoundly moral document. Because what is it? It's about people who have everything. They're beautiful, thin, rich, powerful, glorious, famous, and miserable. Absolutely miserable. Their relationships have failed. Their projects have failed. Their art is ugly. Their lives are terrible. They wear ugly clothes, and they're miserable. Im ein kemach ein Torah, but im ein Torah ein kemach. That's what the second paragraph of the Shema is. People magazine is the modern equivalent of the second paragraph of the Shema. Quote me on that. Right? Your name can be Kardashian. God help you. You may have a monumental derriere, but it doesn't make you happy. Right? Where's that? Someone on a mic. We're going to finish soon because Ben & Jerry's is closing. Yes, please.
During this period of spiritual development for Schulweis and all the rest, was
Good night, you guys. Take care. Just take care. Many blessings. Stay well. Thank you.
Was there discussion of the idea of free will, that God allows free will, and therefore it's kind of a low interference version?
Yeah, no, that's the idea. Look, that's one of the assumptions of all of Jewish tradition is free will. That's why you have mitzvot. Think about this. If you didn't have free will, why would God give you commandments? Either God would program you to do it. In other words, you couldn't put treif in your mouth if you wanted to. Or, if you didn't have free will, it would make no sense to command you to do something. The whole idea of... Yeah, because you have free will. You make choices. You make choices. No, for Schulweis, you make choices. You make choices. And you have to live with the consequences of your choices. That's what he's saying. Now, if you're telling me if there's a God who controls everything, what is the notion of free will? That's a problem. You're right. Right? More than, I mean, look, in the Bible, that's, if you're reading the Torah, we're in the third parsha of book of Shemot right now, and, God keeps hardening Pharaoh's heart. It's like a boxer. He picks that guy up, smacks him in the face, he falls down, he picks him up. And the question is, how can you keep punishing the Pharaoh if he can't decide otherwise? It's a big argument in the tradition. You're right. That's a problem. But the tradition always understood that you are responsible for your choices because you have free will. Because you have free will, you make choices, and you have to live with the consequences of your choices. That's a presumption of the tradition. Okay? And people make bad choices, and people make good choices. Right? People get their names in the newspaper for each, right? Yeah, Mal, who has the... Yeah. Mrs.
First of
how
all,
are
thank you. Fine, thank
Good
you.
to see you.
Thank
I
you.
have to announce something. There's a concert on Sunday. You're here. Cantor Raffi's putting on this amazingly wonderful concert of Broadway and Disney tunes, right? The beautiful music of the Rabbi Velvel Disney. So come Sunday, what time is it in the alley? 4? Yeah, come. It's a beautiful, she has 27 cantors coming. It's a machaya. So please come. Now, you reminded me. Now you can tell her that I told you.
Thank you very much.
We're going to finish in a minute, I promise you.
Now, with what you said,
Yes.
I decided to live godly.
Okay, good.
But-
I'm so glad.
But
Yeah.
what is the relationship
Yeah.
between pursuing to live godly
Yeah.
and the rituals? Like,
Oh, that's a great question. What is the relationship between godliness and ritual? That's a great question. Anyone here exercise? I exercise. I have to from my back, right? Why do you do exercise? It's kind of a fruitless thing, lying on the living room floor trying to do push-ups at my age. You do that because you're training. Ritual is training. I'll give you an example. On my door, there's a mezuzah. Anyone here have mezuzah on their door? On the door. What is a mezuzah? It's a clever thing that I bought in Israel, but the important part of mezuzah is not the box. It's the cloth inside. If you have a box on your door without a parchment inside, you don't have a mezuzah. You have a box. Okay? What's written on that box? Shema Yisrael. It's our statement of faith. Forget the whole thing. Just the first word. Shema. Listen. When I became a young father, my poor wife was stuck at home with small kids, and I was working out in the world, long hours. And I would come home exhausted, and she would meet me at the door exhausted. And the two of us would have an exhaustion contest. I'm more exhausted than you. Oh yeah? I'm more exhausted than you. I had a funeral, 2 weddings, a bar mitzvah, and a board meeting tonight. That's how exhausted I am. Oh yeah? Your son threw up all over the bed. And we would have, anyone ever, have and the person who lost the contest had to make dinner, right? And this is what we used to have, this exhaustion contest standing in the doorway, right? And then I stopped and I said, this is silly. She's been at home with little kids all day. She just wants to talk to a grown-up. And I realized I'm exhausted from my work, but I had to gather myself. So I stood at the door, and there's a tradition that you kiss the mezuzah. But kissing the mezuzah is just kissing the mezuzah. I would stop and I'd say the word shema, which means schmuck, listen. And underneath the word shema is written the word ve'ahavta, love. Because if you love, you will listen. And if you listen, you will show that you love. And I literally stood at the door for about 3 minutes before I opened the door to gather myself so I could honestly say to my wife, how'd the day go? And it changed me. That's a ritual. But it taught me it trained me to do a godly thing better. I put on tefillin in the morning. Tefillin are remarkable. I wrap tough leather straps around my arm and around my head, right? Now, forgive me for the sexist thing I'm about to say. I think it's fine if women put on tefillin. My wife puts on tefillin. But I happen to think it's a masculine thing because I think tefillin is about controlling testosterone. It says, I am going to bind the violence in me and hold it down and channel it into the service of God. All that divine, violent energy that makes me a guy, I have to bind my hand, the power of my violence, and bind my thoughts into something sacred. It reminds me each morning that I am to go into the world and do sacred things. Each one of these rituals is part of a training to put me in the way of godliness. To put me in the way of godliness. Now, what I'm suggesting, though, is a different philosophy of mitzvah. I don't do the mitzvah because God shouted from heaven, Feinstein, no lobster! Got it? That's not how it works. I look at a mitzvah and I ask myself, what is this mitzvah trying to teach me? What is it training me? The mezuzah is training me to stop and listen to the people who live in that house because I love them. And then when I leave the house, to listen to the people in the world because I care for them too. The tefillin teach me to bind the violence of my body and my soul into the service of God. Each one of these mitzvot, I don't eat lobsters because I'm trying to show that I'm not controlled by my animal nature. They're all trying to teach me something. And I have to ask that question, what is it trying to teach me? If I can't find an answer, I don't do it. Or I wait to do it till I can figure it out. The greatest mitzvah we have is Shabbos. I keep Shabbat not because God said so. I keep Shabbat for a really simple reason. You have to be insane not to keep Shabbos in this world. Turn off CNN. Turn it off. Sit down with the people you love. Have a candlelit dinner with a bottle of wine and make love. Now, if that ain't a great religion, I don't know what is. So thank you all very much. Have a great night. We'll see you in a week.